What if everything you've been taught about God was just shaped by someone else's agenda? And I don't mean in some conspiracy theory kind of way, although I do love a good conspiracy theory, but in the most human way possible, through the lens of their own fears, their own time period, their own need for control. I grew up really religious, and I spent years feeling like the bad Christian among my church friends. Even though no one actually said it, I was just so aware of my thoughts and my questions, my sins, secretly building up this whole case against myself for why I wasn't good enough. I remember spotting inconsistencies in the Bible stories, especially in the different ways that God was portrayed. But whenever I'd bring up these questions, I'd just get answers like, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, or you just need to have faith. And instead of those answers actually giving me any peace, they just made me feel worse, like maybe I was the problem. And the crazy thing is, these questions that I was so ashamed of are the same ones that great spiritual teachers throughout history have asked. But when you're in it, when you're trying so hard to fit into this mold, to belong in this ideology or belief system, it's really hard to see that. And I know this might feel uncomfortable. Maybe you're even shifting in your seat right now, especially if you have a little bit of that religious trauma. But that tension is really just this balance between curiosity and fear. It's this weird push-pull of energy. And really, any cognitive dissonance is that exactly. It's conflicting energies. It's energy pushing up against each other. And it's usually something to do with your desire pushing up against your beliefs. So here I was trying to be this good Christian girl for years, just hoping I wouldn't be found out with my secret questions and my secret readings of Buddhist texts to quantum physics. But this isn't just my story. Look around. Churches are getting emptier, but actually over 70% of Americans still identify as spiritual. So it's not that we're giving up altogether. It's just that we're hungry for something deeper, something that bridges that gap between ancient wisdom and our modern understanding of the universe. And think about all that's happening in the world right now. Science isn't just catching up with spirituality. In some ways, it's actually pushing us to ask even bigger questions. Quantum physics is showing us that reality isn't what we thought it was. Consciousness research is making us question everything we thought we knew about the mind and the soul. And even AI is making us dive deep into what it really means to be human and connected to something greater. But here's where it gets really interesting. Everyone's arguing over these ancient texts, what they really mean, what they don't. But what I'm starting to see is that they're like coded messages from the past. And maybe, just maybe, we've been reading them all wrong. And maybe there's a reason that they want us to read it wrong. Because what if they're not rule books that are meant to control us, but they're more like these maps pointing us toward expanding our minds? And what if all the contradictions and the weird stories aren't mistakes or bad writing, but they're like little clues as to how to ascend our own consciousness? And this conversation isn't about making peace with religion or finding some comfortable middle ground. I see it more about breaking free from a two-dimensional understanding of reality. And this 2D understanding is what keeps us playing small, especially when it comes to our spirituality. Because trust me, once you start seeing the bigger picture, there's really no going back to that cramped little box of believe this or else. I've spent the better part of my adulthood diving into this stuff, from the ancient texts to the cutting edge science, or at least what I could understand of it. And I'll tell you what, the truth is way more mind-blowing than anything they taught us in Sunday school. And the best part is, you don't have to throw away everything you've learned. You just have to be willing to see it through fresh eyes. So today, our guest is Sean O'Leary. He's a Catholic priest of 48 years who blew my mind when I first heard him speak. And then when I found out what his book was about, I knew I was all in. He has a PhD in psychology, a background in physics, and despite him being a Catholic priest, he wasn't afraid to ask the questions that so many of us are asking. But instead of throwing it all out, he took that as an invitation to go deeper. And he's also the author of Setting God Free, moving beyond the caricature we've created in our own image. So in this episode, you'll learn why those contradictions in religious texts actually make perfect sense. And no, it's not mysterious ways. How to build your own relationship with the divine without throwing away the good stuff from tradition. And several mind-blowing connections between modern science and ancient spiritual wisdom that changes everything. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. You guys, workplace stress is killing us. 61% of people are dealing with stress levels that are way beyond normal. So if you're feeling it, you are not alone. I used to think I could just push through everything. Work harder, sleep less, pretend I had it all figured out. But that approach nearly broke me. I am all about following your joy. If that voice in your head is telling you to make a change, listen to it. Maybe you are ready to quit your job. Maybe you do need to flip your whole life upside down. But either way, you need support and tools to navigate it well. And that's where therapy comes in. Modern therapy teaches you how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, how to manage anxiety before it spirals, how to make big moves from a place of strength instead of desperation. And BetterHelp has over 30,000 therapists and has helped 5 million people worldwide. And you can talk to someone from your couch. No waiting rooms, no awkward scheduling. Therapy gives you the clarity on whether that voice telling you to make a change is your intuition or just the Sunday scaries. But either way, you deserve support. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Unwind from work with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/mindlove. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/mindlove. I was just talking to a friend who's been trying to hire someone for 3 months. 3 months! She's been posting on random job boards, scrolling through resumes that make no sense, getting ghosted by candidates. It's a mess. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs help you stand out and hire fast. With sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the very top of the page for your relevant candidates so that you can reach the people that you want faster. And it makes a huge difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. One of the things I love about Indeed is that it just makes hiring so fast because you're not wasting time on platforms where nobody's actually looking. Your job gets in front of real candidates who are actively searching. Plus, with Indeed sponsored jobs, there's no monthly subscriptions, no long-term contracts, and you only pay for results. How fast is Indeed? Well, in the minute I've been talking to you, 23 hires were made on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. There's no need to wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/mindlove. Just go to Indeed.com/mindlove right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/mindlove. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
And so I distinguish between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is simply data that are generated by the sensorium and processed by the physical brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so the only way to hear the message, the deep mystical message, is at a heart level. And so you get this great statement which is mistranslated always, where when Jesus is announcing the kingdom, the translation says, repent and believe. That is not what he's saying. What he's saying is, the Greek term that's actually used is metanoia. And metanoia means go beyond the mind. Meta means beyond, and nous is mind in Greek. So he's saying go beyond the mind. The mind is not going to take you there.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
So you've been a Catholic priest for 48 years. You have a PhD in psychology, a background in physics. Most people see these as conflicting paths. What made you decide to weave them together?
For me, there are three parts of the very same puzzle. And so the spirituality for me is the basis of everything, because I believe that we're basically holographic fractals of source. So hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. And so for me, everything that exists is actually an aspect of the divine. So I say sometimes to my congregation that the life is just a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that God is having. So we're God's dream. So we are the way in which God experiences. So every bunny rabbit, every oak tree, every human being is a way in which God experiences incarnation. And so for me, the whole basis of my existence then is that realization that I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. I'm a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for incarnation. But then I find myself in a physical universe, and I need to try to understand the physics of the cosmos. So that's my interest in mathematics and mathematical physics. And then psychology is, we process stuff. We're psychological entities. And the way in which we process, we do it through kind of epistemology, which is how we gather data. And we do it through ontology, which is how we decide what is correct or what we believe to be true. And then cosmology is how we arrange these belief systems of ours into a coherent pattern. And so for me then, these three pieces they come together seamlessly. So I've been fascinated by that intersection since I was a little child.
I have also, and I felt like I was like taking in a breath of fresh air when I found you, because I was raised dogmatically Christian. It still is a point of conflict with my mother and I when she sees, because I am kind of public about my spiritual explorations. And so I'm sure it makes her cringe at different times. I even have a poem pinned to my Instagram profile, and I say, "You are the universe dreaming itself real." And my mom was like, "I just don't understand it." So for me, though, as a child, reading through the Bible, there were just certain things that felt like a conflict, even with what they were teaching me and then what I was reading. And it was like people were unwilling to have the question. It couldn't even be asked without it being blasphemous. And that created a disconnect in my understanding for a really long time. And I went through a period of thinking, okay, maybe there is no God because this all feels like a fairy tale. And then just with my own struggles, I felt my life bringing me back to a connection with God, but I didn't know where to start. So I had to go looking at, I was reading about biblical scholarship, biblical scholars like Bart D. Ehrman and then Marcus Borg. But what I loved about your work is that you come from a priesthood. So it's not denying God altogether, which I also didn't really resonate with. When you were a Catholic priest, did you have this understanding in the beginning, or I know you are a Catholic priest, but did you have the understanding in the beginning, or was it something through your own teaching that you started to say, well, I still have questions that I need to answer?
Right. And so for me, I was raised by my paternal grandparents for the first 6 years of my life, and my great grandmother was still alive. And she was basically a Christian mystic. For her, Mother Mary was more real than you are to me, Melissa. And I would hear her having these out loud conversations with Mother Mary. And I presumed that this was the norm. So in Gaelic, we have a term called a chayaloit, which means a thin place, a place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, and you can pass through. And so that's what the mystics do, obviously, the whole time. And I think that's what little children do. You've got two little babies, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. You watch them at play, and they're in constant contact with the other side. It's their birthright until we kind of educate it out of them. And so I think that this is, every little child is in contact with the divine. So I got that from my great-grandmother. And then at age 6, I moved to live with my maternal grandparents. And my grandfather at that side was a druid. He was a great Irish step dancer. He was a great musician. And he was a great storyteller. So he filled me up with all the old ancient Irish mythology. And so I had these two kind of strands. There was the pagan in the very best sense of that word, and the Christian mystical come together. And so in my I spent 8 years in the seminary after I finished high school, and I'm inducted into kind of rigorous Catholic theology. But then I got to Africa at age 26, and I encountered the extraordinary mythologies of Africa. And I came to the conclusion that mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. If you want to know the wisdom of any people, go to their stories and their parables, and their proverbs. And at one stage, when I was a little boy in high school, I spent the summer holidays in a village in West Cork where Gaelic is still the mother tongue. And I was collecting proverbs. In Irish we call them seanachil, which literally means, ancient words. And I would go around to all the elders in the village and say, give me a seanachil and explain to me in what context you might use it. And I collected 432 proverbs in the course of the summer. But one old man said to me, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. And he was absolutely right. This extraordinary wisdom, that's resident in the mythologies and in the Proverbs and the parables and the stories of every culture. So then I got to Africa, at age 26, and I have the privilege of learning 4 African languages and dipping into the mythologies of these different peoples. And I would say the same thing to them. If Christianity had never come to Africa, you guys could live according to your Proverbs. And so for me then, it's the kind of this understanding that God speaks through all peoples. I don't privilege the kind of the Christian Bible or over the mythology of Africa or the Proverbs of Ireland or the Pitakas of Buddhism, or the kind of the Upanishads. For me, they're all the voice of God. So the question is then, how do we unpack those messages? Are we going to unpack them literally? Are we going to unpack them kind of symbolically? Are we going to unpack them mystically? And so the wisdom of God, permeates all cultures. The question is, have you the ability to kind of look beyond the apparent meaning of it into the deep, deep core meaning of it? And I hear you doing that in what you just told me.
Yeah. And I had a moment of things clicking into place later on when I started understanding marketing, actually, because for a long time I was like, okay, well then all of this kind of seems like bullshit.
Yeah,
and I was devaluing the story side of it. And when I started to deeply understand marketing and realize, wait, it's not all of these facts and figures that move people to a behavior change. And I thought, well, since I'm in the place of facts and figures are what I need to know, this must be how it changes everybody. But then I had to see, that's not what got me here. That's now how I'm validating conclusions that I've already come to. So the facts and figures come later, but to be moved, to be able to understand and see yourself in something, you need the story. And so when I understood that about marketing, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I need to go back to all of those myths, the biblical text, and see the deeper meaning behind all of these parables.
That is brilliant, love. And that for me is the reason why, since you come from a Christian background, you'll understand a lot of the kind of the metaphors. So there's a great passage in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13 where the people are really upset with Jesus. And they said to him, why are you always talking these stupid stories and parables? Why? Talk to us plenty. Give us the facts. Talk theology to us. Talk science to us. Talk philosophy to us. But always this mishegas, all these stupid stories. And he gives 2 different answers. In one place he says, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand, hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. So why would he speak in such a way that they can't understand or comprehend? Because he's saying to them, guys, if you're listening with your mind, with your rational being, you won't get what I'm talking about. You have to listen in a different place. You have to listen at the level of the heart. And so I distinguish between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is simply data that are generated by the sensorium and processed by the physical brain. Whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so the only way to hear the message, the deep mystical message, is at a heart level. And so you get this great statement which is mistranslated always, where when Jesus is announcing the kingdom, the translation says, repent and believe. That is not what he's saying. What he's saying is, the Greek term that's actually used is metanoia. And metanoia means go beyond the mind. Meta means beyond, and nous is mind in Greek. So he's saying go beyond the mind. The mind is not going to take you there. And he's not asking us to believe, he's asking us to trust. There's a huge difference. One is credo, which is an intellectual assent, and the other is cordo, which is to give your heart. So you had two little babies. Those little babies are not making kind of intellectual kinds of beliefs that you're going to look out for them. They trust completely. When they came in, they knew there was going to be a mother with milk and breasts and love who would cuddle them. They trusted completely. They didn't have to make an intellectual assent to this. They knew it in their souls. They knew that. And this is what, the great kind of wisdom traditions are telling us. Listen to us at your soul level, at your heart level. Your mind is not going to take you there. You can try to make sense of it subsequently with your mind, but the mind is not going to take you into the kingdom of God. Only your heart can take you there. And so when I see this notion of Christians beating their breast and saying, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm saying that is not what beating your breast should mean. Beating your breast means I'm trying to wake my heart up. I'm trying to get out of my head and I'm trying to awaken my heart, because that's the only way that I can understand the message of God. And so it's through stories. The second time he's asked in the same chapter of Matthew's Gospel, he says, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the earth. In other words, there are some truths which are so deep that you can't process them intellectually. You can do it through dance or poetry or music or stories, some kind of a creative endeavor, but you can't do it through your intellect. And so for me, that's the weighting of these pieces for me.
Let me ask you something. How much time did you spend last week thinking about what to eat? Planning meals, making grocery lists, wandering around the store like a lost tourist. I used to waste entire Sunday afternoons on this, and it was exhausting. Then I found Hungry Root. Hungry Root fills your cart with personalized picks and plans your week of meals, getting smarter with every order. They have over 15,000 recipes to choose from each week, and most are ready in 15 minutes or less. I'm actually headed to Michigan this week, and I had my Hungry Root order delivered there. So I already know that I have meals ready and plenty of snacks for the kids without scrambling to find a grocery store. It's just handled. And what I love most is their smart cart technology. It learns what I actually like and then recommends groceries, recipes, and supplements just for me. So no more buying spinach that rots in my fridge. They screen out over 200 additives and only source high quality ingredients. The time I've gotten back has just been life-changing. So take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box, plus get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/mindlove and use code MINDLOVE. That's hungryroot.com/mindlove, code MINDLOVE, to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/mindlove, code MINDLOVE. Your book's title is Setting God Free. And to me, that was what actually brought me. I was like, I must read this book and I must read it quickly because I didn't really understand, or I didn't see that that's what I've been trying to do through my understanding for such a long time. And just those simple words, I'm like, yes, this. It feels like, and I think it's just because of the environment I grew up in, I've been developing this relationship with God that's gotten deeper and deeper over the years through my own understanding. And also, there's still a piece of me, maybe it's because it comes from my parents, or that it's my childhood wound or something, that I'm still like justifying, or like, no, you need to understand in order for me to like flow into this even more deeply. And something about reading your book and the sequence that you portrayed it, where you actually go into the a huge part of the Old Testament and break down what those stories are saying. And it's funny because about 5 years ago, I was like, okay, now I've done all this spiritual exploration. How will this change the way I see the Bible? And I went back to Genesis and I started to read, and all I could see were all of these murders. And I was like, how is nobody talking about this? How come nobody mentioned this when I was going to church for 17 years? How come when I speak this, no one seems to understand that this is right here? It's almost every single verse. So why did you choose to structure your book that way? And first kind of give this perspective or shine light on what my soul has been screaming for decades.
Right, right. So I'm a big believer. I claim that in order to be an enlightened being, you have to do four murders. You have to murder four things. The first one is the ego. You have to realize the ego is important. You can't drive a car, or pay your taxes without an ego. But the ego is not the soul. They're totally different. The ego is the servant of the soul. So the ego is simply the CEO of waking consciousness. It has its purpose and its point, but it is not who I am. And so the first thing, you have to kill this kind of identification with the ego. That's the first murder. The second murder, I have to kill my father. By that, I mean, I have to go beyond, I got to transcend my culture of origin, because every culture is simply a partial understanding of the truth. So I need to investigate all of the other cultures and cross-fertilize them. So in some senses, I have to kill my culture, not in the sense that I don't appreciate it anymore, but that I transcend it. And transcend means to include, but go beyond. And I think that's what Jesus did at age 12 when he's lost in the temple. He's debating with the scholars because he's been raised in a Jewish household. Now he's going to investigate a bunch of others. So there's a possibility, in fact, that Jesus went to Tibet and India and Egypt and Persia, learning from the other great wisdom traditions. So the second murder is, I got to kill my culture. The third murder, I got to kill my guru, because there is no teacher who can take you all the way. Because you're a unique individual with a unique mission. So your guru can take you a lot of the way, but not all the way. So it's not about disrespecting the guru. It's about realizing that the guru has to set you free for your own journey, to go where nobody else has gone before, not even the guru. And the fourth one is, I have to kill my God. And this was a statement made by this great Christian mystic of the 1300s, Meister Eckhart, where he said, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. In other words, I have to transcend mere theology and realize that theology cannot capture God. Only the mystics have the understanding, because God is basically ineffable, inarticulatable. There's nothing, we can't pin God down to a theology. So I've got to transcend my theology. Now I can use my theology as a building blocks to help me get beyond it, but I can't, I have to kill the God created by theology in order to access the God of the mystery. So that for me that's what I was thinking about, that I have to engage in these four murders. And then I have to go, God, the God that we've worshipped, I put him on trial for crimes against humanity, and come to the realization that, this God that we've created a God in our image and likeness. We who have been built in God's image and likeness have returned the favor, and we've created God in our image and likeness. So we've projected all our goodness and all our shadow material onto God. And so the God of whom we are afraid is the shadow we've created because we haven't owned our own stuff. So Carl Jung was very clear about this, that, he said the shadow is 80% gold and 20% repressed traumata. So the shadow is 80% unrealized potential. So we have to dig into that. What parts of myself, what parts of my culture, what parts of my theology, what parts of my guru, do I need to kind of emulate? And what parts do I need to transcend and go beyond? The 20%, which is repressed darkness. And most of us, we project our shadow onto other people. So if I project my negative shadow onto some other person, I'm going to have interpersonal conflict with that person. If we do that as a culture, we're going to create racism of various kinds. If we do that as a global community, we project all our own unacknowledged darkness onto nature itself, onto Pachamama and Gaia, and we destroy it. We ravage it and rape it. And so we've done the same with God, that, this God that we find in so many scriptural traditions, if you read them literally, is literally the shadow of the human species writ large and projected outside of ourselves. And then we're afraid of the shadow that we've created ourselves. So the job of the book was to set God free to be who God is, and to withdraw our projections from God and to own our own stuff and deal with our own darkness.
One of my biggest struggles is, to me, even as a child, reading through the Bible, like I immediately noticed glaring inconsistencies. And I remember trying to bring them up and just sort of being pushed away. And so then, like I said, I went off the path, came back to the path, and then that's all I can see again. And so part of my work has been, read a lot of Ram Dass, and one of his
Okay.
quotes that I love, most said quotes, is "We're all just walking each other home." But he also
Beautiful.
teaches how all of these things are paths to God. And as much as my spirit wants to respect that and does at a level, there's like my intellect that can't be like, I don't understand how you've spent 50 years with this religion and you haven't had these same questions. And so my ego gets up there and I'm like, what? Why don't you see this? Are you dense?
So I think there comes a time in every one of our lives when we're ready for the next stage of our evolutionary process. And we can't kind of artificially kind of hasten the process. You know, that God will send the kinds of circumstances and the kinds of people and the kinds of events into our lives that we're ready for. And so while we thirst for the divine, we have to wait for the timing. It has to be God's timing. This is God's gig. So I can't, kind of hasten the timeline, or create the kinds of events. I have just to be open to the situation in which I find myself. And so what I think is then there's no relationship in your life and there's no event that happens, and there's no event in human history which can't be kind of harvested for our own spiritual development. Christ is the master of paradoxical kind of parables. So he tells this great parable one time about a very rich man who had a steward who was in charge of all his property. He put him in charge of all his property. And then he found out after a few years that this guy was embezzling his property. So he calls him for a reckoning. He says, I need to see the books. It's been brought to my attention that you've been embezzling my property. And the guy, the steward, thinks, holy God, what am I going to do now? I'm too old to get a real job. I'm too embarrassed to beg. What am I going to do? So he calls in all his master's debtors and he says, Melissa, how much do you owe my master? And Melissa says, 50 barrels of wine. And he says, here's your bill, change it to 30. Sean, how much do you owe my master? I owe him 100 bushels of wheat. Here's your bill, make it 80. And then Christ said a very strange thing. He said, the master praised the unjust steward insofar as he had acted wisely, because the children of this generation are wiser to their kind than the children of light. Now, is he praising this guy's duplicity? Absolutely not. What he's saying is this: here was a guy who could turn every single situation to his own economic advantage. When he was employed, he was embezzling. But even when he got fired, he was making agreements with the debtor. So he'd go out and say, bakshishi, I want some of that back. So he was able to turn every single situation to his own economic advantage. And Christ is saying, why can't you guys do that, spiritually? Why can't you turn every situation in your life to your own spiritual evolutionary trajectory? So in other words, he's saying there's no situation in which you find yourself. There's no event that's happening which you can't harvest for spiritual nourishment. So that's the journey then, is just to allow life to kind of afford me the opportunities and the relationships and the events and say, okay, what can I do with this situation? How can I learn? How can I awaken even further by dealing with this particular situation? So I have a kind of 5-point plan that I use for myself. Because an old man in Africa told me one time, he said to me, why is it for you Europeans that your only response to a problem is to want to solve it? I'm thinking, dude, what do you do with a problem except solve it? So I said to him, what do you do when you have a problem? And I never forget what he said to me. We were speaking in Swahili, but he said, a problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do is solve the problem, life will just give you another problem. And if your response to the second problem is just to solve it, life will give you a third problem. And so for me, the 5 stages of when I'm faced with any kind of practical problem in my life, I try to lead myself in the following way. The first thing I say is, first stage one, I am a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for incarnation. Second one, I chose to be here now. I chose the physical body I have, the culture I came from, the place I'm living right now, the relationships in it. I chose those and I'm here at the right time, stage 2. The third stage is I want to thank God for all the blessings in my life. There's a myriad of blessings I'm constantly receiving. So why should I just be focused on this particular problem? That's stage 3. The fourth one then is, okay, as I address this problem, how can I harvest it for my ongoing spiritual evolution? And then, and only then, let me deal with the practicalities of how I'm going to address this particular issue that I'm faced with. But most of us are going to go straight to number 5. We forget all the other stages. So if I go through the other stages, by the time I get to number 5, I've got a totally different perspective. I can see possibilities and connections that I couldn't see if I went straight to a solution. So that's why I say, when you say to me, why am I 50 years wrestling with this? If you were harvesting everything that happened to you along the road, that's why you're here where you're at right now. This is the time to do the next stage of it. It's not that you were asleep at the wheel, it's that you were harvesting the events of your life to kind of make the steps, the baby steps initially, that were necessary in order to bring you to the place you're at right now.
When I began researching the Bible, a lot of what I learned was how humanity, like you said, we're creating God in our image in these writings, understanding that not one author of the Bible thought that they were writing a Bible or a holy text. They're creating their journals across hundreds of years of time, and then a different group compiled all of those. And so for me, just understanding that allows me to see, okay, well then of course there's going to be flaws. However, you also outline a ton of, basically millions of murders that are directly commanded supposedly by God in the Bible.
Yep.
And so on one hand, I understand that there are parables that have a deeper meaning that should be found. And on the other, it was created by man, and some to justify what they were currently doing in their lives. And how do you find the balance of when to seek deeper meaning and when to pass it off as potentially just a human flaw?
Yeah. So it becomes very important. And let's just focus on the kind of the Judeo-Christian scriptures for a minute then, Melissa. So you have to, and obviously you've done a lot of study about the historicity of this document. The first thing we have to realize is that the Bible is written between 950 BCE and about 400 BC, the Hebrew scripture part of it. So you've got like a 500-year trajectory during which stories were gathered and mythology was made up. Now, so it's compiled basically around the year 550 BCE, when the last two tribes of Israel are in exile in Babylon. The 10 northern tribes were demolished in 722 BCE by the great Assyrian Empire, and they're heard of no more. There's only two tribes left, Benjamin and Levi. And now they're barely hanging on to their existence. And now they're in exile in Babylon. And so they're thinking, how can we maintain our culture, our belief systems? And so at this stage, fighting from four different traditions. They're called J, E, P, and D. J is the text in which God is called Jehovah or Yahweh. E is the text in which God is known as Elohim, which is actually a plural, meaning the powerful ones. P is the which is made up by the priests, and D is the book of Deuteronomy. So they're four totally different strands of information, and they're pulled together, and they're very, very badly edited. In some instances, you get three versions of the very same story, totally contradict each other. So what's the scoop? The scoop is you have a people desperately kind of trying to hang on to their individuality as a culture. And so they're going to create this mythology. And the purpose of mythology is threefold. It is to explain our origins. It is to give us the strength to understand our present predicament. And it is to give us a roadmap for the future where we're headed. And all cultures do that. I grew up with the Celtic mythology. We've got these great folk heroes, and many of them are these warlike characters who are just killing left, right, and center. So we have to believe somehow, every group has to believe that they're special, that they're particularly chosen of God. And then they have to invent this heroic history, which is fictitious, and it involves slaughtering people who are different from us. And so now you're going to build this mythology of stories in which we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and it was beholden on us to kill the bad guys. And it'll give us the courage to survive present vicissitude, and it'll give us a roadmap for the future. And all cultures under pressure are going to do that. So that's the story then of particularly the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's a people, on the edge of being extinguished completely, trying to kind of create some kind of a belief system that will hold them together as a nation. And they survived. And in 539 BCE, the Persian Empire overcame the Babylonians and set the remnant of the Israelites back into the land of Israel, where they rebuilt the temple. And so we have to understand now, this is a document that took 500 years in the composition, and it's tweaked continually. There are economic reasons for the tweaking, there are political reasons for it, there are theological reasons for it, there are spiritual reasons for it, and you put all these together, and you got this mishmash. And now we're going to read it as the Word of God, as if it's absolutely literal. And of course it's not. When we understand that it's mythology, in the very best sense of the word mythology, it's empowering us to survive and to kind of create a roadmap for the future, whom we want to become as a people. So that's my understanding of the Hebrew scriptures.
I loved how you looked at the depiction of Yahweh through a psychological lens.
Okay.
What happens when we start looking at divine figures through a more psychological lens? What's the purpose of that?
The purpose of that is to realize that the human psyche is subject to all kinds of self-delusions. And so our psyche is formed by our experiences. I think it's formed by reincarnational experiences. But for little baby particularly, we are putty in the hands of our parents and of the school system. And so we're inculcated into a particular belief system. And everything we subsequently experience is going to be filtered through that. So I'm a really, really big believer. I'm constantly advocating to people, you must create your own personal cosmology. And all the great teachers tell us that. So you have Gautama Siddhartha saying, I call himself Buddha, which means I am awake. You have Socrates saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. You have Jesus Christ saying, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. So it's about coming awake. Now, every single one of us is living life driven by a philosophy of life which has been unconsciously acquired from our parents, from our teachers, from the mass media, from the churches. And you put us in any situation and our response would be driven by that internalized philosophy of life. But we have unconsciously acquired it, and now we're unconsciously accessing it in any particular situation. And so the job of coming awake is about radically reassessing my belief systems and creating a personal cosmology. And I advocate that the skeleton of a personal cosmology is the answer to 4 questions. The first question is, who is God? Who do I think God is? Is God this distant, demanding deity, this punitive genocidal maniac that we read of in some scriptures? Is that how I believe? Or is God a loving mother? Second question is, who am I? When I say I, what do I mean? Do I mean this skin-encapsulated ego? Do I mean my profession? Do I mean my thoughts? Do I mean my relationships? What do I mean when I say I? And for me, the answer to that is, I'm a bite-sized piece of God. I'm a soul in safari. The third question is, who is my neighbor? What does that mean? When I say neighbor, what do I mean by neighbor? Is the guy who looks the same as me or votes the same way that I vote? Or what do I mean by neighbor? And Christ covers this in the beautiful parable of the Good Samaritan. And the fourth question is, what is my mission? What did I come down here to do? And so every single one of us needs to create a personal cosmology. And it should do 4 things for me. It should make my soul sing. If my cosmology is adequate, my soul will sing in response to it. Secondly, it will stretch me out of my comfort zone because I have to grow into places I haven't been used to yet. The third thing is it needs to be able to explain every experience I have. If there are areas of my life that my personal cosmology can't give me a response to, the cosmology is inadequate still. And the fourth thing is I need to constantly update it. So there's this great passage it's in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where Thomas says, in the Synoptic Gospels we hear, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be opened. But the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas has a totally different hit. He says there are 6 stages to the process. He says, those who seek should not stop searching until they find. Stage 2 is they find. And he said, when they find, they will be disturbed. And when they're disturbed, they will marvel. And when they marvel, they will rule. And when they rule, they will rest. They're the 6 stages. So what did he mean? He said, anybody who sets out on the spiritual journey as a seeker, they're going to find. And when they find, they're going to be really disturbed. Because it won't be the version of spirituality that they were raised on. It won't be a punitive God. It won't be a God who's our God and we're the good guys and everybody else is going to go to hell. It's not going to be that. So I'm going to be really, really disturbed. So it's like I'm pulling the rug out from underneath me. Now, for many of us, we want to go back now to Mama Church, and the safety of being told what to believe. If we continue, we're going to reach stage 3, which is to marvel. Because now I begin to realize the extraordinary nature of who God is, and what the mission on planet Earth is. And when I get that and I marvel, then I rule. Not in the sense that I have power over anybody else, but that now I have total jurisdiction over my own spiritual journey. Yeah, and then I can rest because I know now I'm being guided. My GPS system is my soul. It is not my ego, and it is not my culture. And so in that sense, I can rest because I know what my trajectory is.
I had a conversation with my mom once, and she said, I just feel like you're taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you're putting together your own religion. You can't do that. And for me, I'm like, well, all you did was let somebody else do that for you. And then it's their own agenda rather than finding your
Right.
own truth.
Yes.
So when I actually started to look into the Gnostic Gospels and, like I said, understand why certain ones were put in there, why certain ones weren't, what the process was, you can see whether they had a sinister agenda or just their own biased beliefs or just their own worldview that they're putting things together, the time that they were coming from. It makes more sense. If the Old Testament was put together this year, I think it would look a lot different than all of these murders and killing of their brothers and whatever, because we're seeing it through the lens of culture as well. And even breaking down Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and seeing how the exact same story is told in different ways, but then understanding, wait, what year was that written? What region was that written in? What were their main points of conflict? One of them that I understood was in one of the books of the New Testament, that story is just told where Jesus almost seems like a victim walking to the cross. My
Yes.
God, why have you forsaken me? He
Yes.
didn't say a whole lot.
Right.
In other
Right.
ones, he's saying these long, flowery speeches, but to understand that what they were dealing with in that time was a lot of victimhood and how just kind of going through one foot in front of the other was their message of hope. Versus that story were to be told somewhere else, they needed a different kind of message of hope. And when you get to see that, to me, it becomes more multifaceted, more beautiful. But to others, it's like, wait, this isn't the story that I've heard. You're asking too many questions. You're going too deep. And it becomes some sort of source of fear.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely, you're right on. And so I love the response that you gave to your mother about that. That she's accusing you of cherry picking from many traditions and making your own religion out of it, and you're telling her you just allowed other people to do that for you. You're absolutely right. So just to take the point on this, let's say even the Gospels, the four Gospels, and you realize that there are totally different agendas here, and they're written for totally different audiences. So you take, for instance, Matthew's gospel. Matthew is a Jewish writer writing for a Jewish audience, and he's trying to show that Jesus is the new Moses. And the very way he constructs his gospel, he does it in 5 sections, which is kind of parallel to the 5 books of Torah. Yeah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Matthew is trying to show the people that Jesus is the new Moses. So Jesus will spend 40 days in the desert, where Moses had spent 40 years in the desert, and that Moses will come with a covenant and Jesus will come with a new covenant. So Matthew's intention is to speak to a Jewish audience with the kind of understanding of the Hebrew scriptures. Luke is the only writer of scripture that's not Jewish. And Luke is writing for a Gentile audience. In fact, he's directing his letter. He wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, and they're both addressed to a guy called Theophilus. And Theophilus in Greek literally means God lover, somebody who loves God. So it may just be a kind of a name. So he's saying anybody who's interested in God may be interested in this story. But much more likely, Theophilus was actually some kind of a Roman governor that Luke was friends with. And he's trying to persuade Theophilus that the Christian religion is not a threat to Rome. So he's presenting, even the way that Luke presents Pilate in the trial of Jesus, he's saying more or less, Pilate washed his hands and said, I'm innocent of the blood of this man. So as far as Luke is concerned, he's trying to persuade a Roman governor that the Romans have nothing to fear from Christianity. Look, even Pilate realized, that this man was innocent and said, you guys want to crucify him, take him away and crucify him. I have nothing got to do with this. So you got totally different agendas coming through for very different audiences. So what you said a few minutes ago is right on. The agenda will dictate kind of the tenor that a particular writing going to take. And it'll be changed over years. It'll be redacted and edited in various ways for different audiences at different times. So the question then becomes, what is the core, essential, mystical message of the Gospels, or of the Upanishads, or the Pitakas of Buddhism? What is the core, mystical core of it? And every individual person must do that for themselves. We can't rely on an institution to do it, because an institution will always have an agenda. So the question is, what is God saying to me when I read these particular scriptures? If I open myself to spirit, what is the message that God is trying to communicate to me in 2024, December 2024, in the United States of America?
And even people on a similar spiritual path are meant to get different understandings, different downloads from the same things. We're
Absolutely.
all unique beings looking at everything that we come in contact with through our own perspective based on our life experiences and our own baggage. And so it's almost silly to try to tell anyone's story in a way of this is the only way to understand it, because in that way, you're not giving anybody an understanding. They're not going to grok it within themselves. It's going to be just this memorization, which is sort of what we're taught to do our entire lives anyways.
Yeah, brilliant. And so there's a kind of an image that I use sometimes where, so let's suppose a group of friends of mine decide they want to go to Ireland and do a bike tour of Ireland. And they say to me, we'd like you to lead us because you're Irish and you know the terrain. So we arrive in Ireland with our bicycles and we start from the first day, and I pedal like hell. And I'm way ahead of the group. So they get to the first intersection and they have no idea, did I go right? Did I go left? Did I go straight ahead? I'd be a terrible leader if I was so far ahead of them that they couldn't see me when they got to the first junction. On the other hand, if I'm sitting in the middle of the pack and there are some of the riders all the way ahead of me, and when they get to the first intersection, they have to stop and wait for us to catch up for me to tell them which way to go, then I'd still be a very bad leader. So the ideal leader is somebody who's far enough ahead of the pack to provide leadership, but not so far ahead of the pack that he's out of sight. And this is kind of the teaching of the great teachers, and Jesus particularly. He has to kind of give his message in such a way that people can follow where he's leading, but that he's not so far ahead that we can't make sense of what he's saying, and that he's not sitting in the middle of the pack so that he can't give us any leadership. So when you look at the statements of Jesus, he will say something like, the same things I do, you will do, and even greater, because I'm going to go back to the Father and send the Spirit. In other words, you're going to have an internal guidance system, and you have to listen to that guidance system. And so when we elect in some way, leaders in any way, if they're true leaders, they're only going to be a little bit ahead of us to show us the road, but not that we lose sight of them. If Jesus were to tell us the final understanding of God, it would be so unintelligible, it would mean nothing to anybody. So he has to kind of measure the teachings in such a way that it's stretching us, but it's stretching us within our capacity to kind of grok it in some way. And so every great teacher is kind of is faced with that. As you raise your two little children, the direction you give them has to be within their ability to understand what you're saying to them as a mother. You can't treat a 3-year-old as a 21-year-old, and relate to the 3-year-old as a 21-year-old. So you're going to pace yourself in the teachings you give to your children to make sure that you're leading them forward, but that they can understand what you mean. You're not so far ahead of them that they have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's being that sort of bridge between two levels of understanding. And I think that's been what I've received as my mission here. I've always been good at kind of going back and forth, and part of me is like, I wish I had the freedom to go live in a cave and just reach enlightenment. And then I always get the message that is not what you're meant to do here. You're supposed to be right in the weeds. But another concept that some people find threatening, but I find freeing, is realizing that, yes, we can see the historical lens of where empires came in and they wanted to provide historical legitimacy to their reign. And so they made certain alterations or translation differences. But those kinds of things are still happening today.
Yes.
There's still regimes that aim to keep power. And by doing that, it's known since the beginning of time that divide and conquer is a strategy.
Absolutely.
On one of my favorite Instagram accounts, what I love about her is her whole account is she'll just repost messages that come in. So it ends up being like a whole forum of people having a discussion in her stories. And the religion discussion came up recently about Islam and people being fearful of Islam, and other people sharing what they've learned. I read a book on it that gave me a deeper understanding. But what I found really profound was a lot of people chiming in that their grandmother had said, like in Albania or in all these other countries that I've never been to, don't have experience with, how, and even in the Middle East, Muslims, Christians, Jews all lived together as neighbors, understanding that they were Abrahamic religions, sharing the same God, and they'd even participate in each other's rituals because they were neighbors. Whereas now it's like, oh, I can't do that. It's against my religion. And they spoke about how a lot of them had stories that it was until the Second World War that they came in and then divided these countries even more. And they seemed to think it was a deliberate strategy. And so when we understand that, it's like, oh, but I've heard this, because for a long time, it's like I've had a fear. Even when I was doing spiritual exploration, I'm like, okay, yes, I believe this, but let me just make sure I've accepted Jesus into my heart just in case I'm wrong and I go to hell. You know, it's like this always like fail safe for years and years. And I think people still have that, where it's like, okay, yes, I can see the truth and the oneness behind all of it. And they're all essentially teaching the same things, but just in case I'm wrong, I'm going to shun this, or just in case I'm wrong, I'm going to shun this. But when you understand that you have those feelings, you've gotten those messages from people that have their own agendas to maintain their power, to me, that's freeing. But to someone who's held closely their religion, that can be threatening.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so I believe that I wrote a kind of what I call the Light Workers Manifesto about 2 years ago, about the great changes that have to happen right across the human spectrum, everything from our economic models, our agricultural systems, our medical models, you know, our educational systems. And I ended it by saying, you know, we have to go beyond the era of Rome and Mecca. That is not where spirituality is guiding us anymore. It has to be the individual trajectory, you know, that is willing to learn from all systems, to pick what is beautiful, to use your own phrase of earlier on, to be able to pick from different systems and say, yes, that teaching of that group or that ritual of this other group really, really appeals to me. It makes my heart sing. It makes my soul soar. And so I'm quite prepared to learn from all of the kind of wisdom traditions of the world. So it's interesting that, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 7,000 different languages on the planet. Now we've lost 2,000 of them in the 20th century. There's only 5,000 left. And for me, a language is not just a kind of a different way of kind of a different grunt for the same object in the physical universe. So that, for instance, if I see an elephant in East Africa, if I'm speaking Swahili, I'm going to say Tembo. If I'm going to speak in Kalenjin, I'm going to say Beliot. If I am speaking English, I'm going to say elephant. And so that some people think that languages are just kind of different sounds for the same object in the physical universe. And that's not true. The purpose of language is much, much, much deeper than that. Yeah, language holds the kind of the mindset and the culture and the kind of the mythology of a people. So when you lose a language, you use a whole kind of perspective on life. And the same thing is true, you know, when we try to kind of amalgamate and create like that, demolish all religions and create just kind of some kind of a singular kind of a religious system that everybody can kind of kowtow to, we're missing the extraordinary variety that these people offer to us. Now, the problem with variety is that I can think that my particular variety of religion is the only one, and then I'm in big trouble. And so if I can understand that everyone is a road to God and try to pick out what is of value in the systems liturgically or scripturally, you know, and create a kind of a meta understanding of the divine, then everybody can be my neighbor and everybody can be my teacher, and nobody is my enemy at that stage. But when you start institutionalizing religion, we got problems. There was a great Hindu mystic, I think it may have been Ramana Maharshi, who said at one stage, if you meet the tracks of religion in the desert, follow them. But don't go where they're leading, go back to where they came from. Because every religious system began with some kind of a mystical impulse. But then an oligarchy takes it over and a kind of dogmatic institutionals, you know, and there'll be crusades and inquisitions. And so almost inevitably, the mystical origin of religion, you know, gets trampled under the kind of orthodoxy of dogmatic belief systems. So we have to make sure that we eschew the dogma and try to recognize what is the mystical core that gave birth to this system in the first place, and go back to that, you know, and include that in my own spiritual journey, but not necessarily the kind of the dogmatic teachings or the sense of exclusivity that any group kind of abrogates to itself.
I don't think people often really understand the power of words. I remember one of my favorite studies to call back to is learning that they found in uneducated communities there was actually a lower emotional scale because they would default to the emotions of the words that they knew and they didn't have the complexity in between. And so that's why one of the reasons I'm so interested in learning words from other cultures that don't have a direct translation. Like one of my favorites, there's one Meraki in Greek, and it's to do something with soul, creativity, and love, to put something of yourself into your work. And that's just not translated here. But the more we can understand the intricacies of all languages, what other people have found, and try to understand it within ourselves, we're going to have a greater depths of human experience. And so to understand, if I was going to devote my entire life to Christianity, one of the things I would be doing most is saying, what was lost in translation? What did the original things say? What are the ways I could translate that? What are ways that maybe people haven't translated that and I see it because of my own experience?
Brilliant. And so typically the linguists tell us that there are basically three ways to translate from language A to language B. And the first one is called a literal translation, where you can translate a verb with a verb, a noun with a noun, an adjective with an adjective. And actually that gets into big trouble because there are some concepts that get totally lost, like puns get lost, or even weights and measures. What is, when Christ says, the parable of the talents, what does that mean in American currency right now? So literal translations don't really work that well. The second one is called dynamic transference, where you try to understand the mindset and the sociology of the writer for the context in which it was composed and what the writer may have had in mind. That's the second way of translating. And the third one is called paraphrasing, where you start off with a preconceived notion of what you wanted to say, and then you translate it in the service of your own prejudices. So it becomes really important when we're translating particularly scriptural passages, because many of our biblical translations are paraphrases, where fundamentalist Christians with a predetermined agenda are translating the Greek and the Hebrew to force it into their own belief systems. So then we have to be really careful. What is the best mindset to approach any kind of a scriptural tradition? And I think you can have an appreciation of the dynamic transference to try and understand what period did it come from, what was the audience, who was the writer, what were the circumstances, and that's helpful. But the most important part of all is the mystical mindset that you bring to the reading. That is even more important than dynamic transference. If you're coming at any scripture from a mystical perception, you're going to see the deep transcendental impact of that, which is even more important than the dynamic transference as a kind of a translation. And so literally, when I look at some of the gospel passages, for instance, I think the fact that they were written by the evangelists doesn't necessarily mean they're the most accurate. So one of my favorite examples is St. Luke, for instance, says, you must be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. He's quoting Jesus, you must be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. Now, what he doesn't realize, he's writing in Greek, but Jesus wasn't speaking Greek. Jesus was speaking Aramaic. And the word in Aramaic for compassion is rachamim. And rachamim is the plural of the Aramaic word for a womb. So what he's saying is, you must be womb-like, and the word that Christ is using, which is translated as father, is the word avon in Aramaic. And avon is a gender-neutral term. It means the birthing principle of the cosmos. So here's Christ saying, you must be womb-like as the birthing principle of the cosmos is womb-like. Now, you take that down 1,300 years to Meister Eckhart, and Meister Eckhart's understanding of this is that every single one of us is meant to be a mother of God. We are meant to be the womb, the incarnated womb, in which God incarnates again and again and again. And so that every baby, for me, is the latest revelation of God, is the latest prophet whom God has sent to us. And every single one of us is meant to give birth to God. Meister Eckhart said very famously in a Christmas homily in about the year 1300, he said, of what use to me is it that my Savior was born of a virgin 1300 years ago? If he's not born again in my time and in my heart, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. And that literally, so that's a mystical unpacking of something that Luke didn't understand. Luke, who was writing the gospel, 2,000 years ago, had a lesser understanding of what he was saying than Meister Eckhart had 1,300 years after him. So that's where I say that the most important mindset to bring to any scriptural kind of analysis is a mystical understanding, not even a linguistic, not even linguistic experience or a linguistic ability is going to take us to the deep core meaning of Scripture.
It reminds me of having a complex dream, and then you wake up and you try to tell it, and it won't come out because you realize words don't actually describe what you experienced, and nothing can actually contain that. And so, yes, it's like have a breadth of words so that you can describe more things, but also don't expect every experience to be able to be simplified enough to have a linguistic interpretation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there was another, maybe the most famous linguist of the 20th century was a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist. And he broke spoken language into three parts. He called it the referent, the signified, and the signifier. And what he meant by this. So let's say I am walking in the bush in East Africa and I see this creature with this long neck. Okay, so he would say the referent is the object in the real world that I'm looking at. Now I'm going to create a signified in my mind. I'd have an image of this. So it'll be part visual, it'll be part olfactory, it'll be part kind of tactile if I reach out and touch the creature. So the image in my mind is kind of composite, and he called that the signified. And the thing in the real world is the referent. Now I'm going to talk to you about it, and I'm going to say to you, I saw, and now I'm going to give a word to the signified, the image I have in my head. I'm going to have to kind of boil down to a particular word. And he calls that the signifier. Now here's the problem. I have no idea whether or not you understand the signifier I've used in the same way that I've used it. When I say twiga in Swahili, or I'm missing the word for it in English now, giraffe. If I say giraffe, I have no idea whether you understand by the word giraffe what I mean by the word giraffe. So the signifier is faulty. But even the signified is faulty. I have no idea that the image created in mind bears any resemblance to the referent out there. Because basically I'm living in a soup of electromagnetic waves. And I'm downloading that, and I'm transforming it into an image of a twiga in my mind. And so I have no idea whether or not what's in my mind is actually corresponds to what's out there. And we know from quantum mechanics that it is consciousness that creates reality. Is it a wave or is it a particle? It depends whether or not it's been observed. And so the problem with all language is that it crunches up the reality, the referent. So how would you get about that? If it were possible to kind of do some kind of telepathic transfer, where I could take the contents of my mind and put them into your mind. At least now we're not having to deal with signifiers, with the words, but I'm still transferring a signified from my mind to your mind. So is there some way that can actually transfer the referent into your experience and my experience? And only the mystical can do that. The only kind of mystical transfer of information, which isn't dependent on signifiers or signified, is something that predates language completely, or predates even the physical brain, and it goes straight to the heart and the soul. And so when souls communicate, then we kind of avoid that danger of falling into a signified trap or a signifier trap. And that's why Jesus will speak in stories, because with stories you're free to allow your soul to engage with the material rather than your head to engage with the material.
I think what my deeper spiritual exploration has led me to, that has been the most life-changing, is the concept that we are all fractals of God. Whereas I grew up believing, I was unworthy, needed this other essence in order to make myself worthy. Otherwise, I'm just going to default to sin at all times. And it's so interesting to me that even the very book I was reading has scriptures like, and I've said, ye are gods, all of you are children of the Most High. Like, it says it over and over again, but the understanding that was passed on to me was nothing like that. And so then going to Eastern religions and being like, okay, well, is everything so conflicting? But then the deeper I go, realizing, wait, it's all saying the same things. But what that understanding gave me is previously I would have most likely assumed, well, if nobody else interpreted it this way, then there must not be validity to this interpretation. Or other people must be smarter. They need to tell me what this means. Whereas now I'm like, I've never heard this before. Yes, that's it. It's like, here is I am a fractal of God having my own experience. So my experience is unique and valid and worthy and needed. And so just me having that experience, that understanding, I don't need to make someone else understand my exact point of view. By the very act of me experiencing it, me understanding this unique way is me doing God's work because I am experiencing as God.
100% agree with you. Absolutely, Melissa. And so, God wouldn't have created you if you hadn't a special task. If you weren't contributing something, unique to the kind of the divine experience in human guise, you wouldn't have been created. And so the very fact that you're on planet Earth means that you have a special mission given you by God, as has everybody else. So the question then becomes, what is my mission? The fourth question in the personal cosmology. What have I come down here to do? And we come down here, the first thing is to wake ourselves up to our inner divinity. The second thing is to try to help others wake up to their inner divinity. And the third thing is to try to create Christ consciousness on the planet. And by Christ consciousness, I mean Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all creatures. That simply is what Christ consciousness is. You can call that self-realization, or you could call it discovering your Buddha nature. It doesn't matter what term you give to it. But basically, Christ consciousness is having a permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all creatures, including yourself, and realizing that you're a unique articulation of the divine, and you've been sent with a purpose. You have a mission. And you're going to cooperate with other people who also have been sent with a mission. And it is to awaken the Christ consciousness in our planet at our times.
And when we activate something within ourselves, even from the scientific perspective of mirror neurons and neural coupling, we spread that in ripple effects, whether or not we ever logically convince somebody of our way of being, just by us being able to be in that energy, be in that mindset, creates the change that we came here for.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's this great notion in Buddhism of the tulpa, and the tulpa is kind of the personification of the energies that we create through our thoughts, our words, and our actions. So every one of us is walking around carrying this extraordinary tulpa, which is the energy created by our being. Now, the tulpa can be really dark. If my energy is kind of what I'm depressed, or I'm anxious, or I'm angry, or I'm avaricious, or I'm violent, I'm carrying this tulpa around with me. But it interfaces with your tulpa. And so there's the tulpa of the family that grew up together. There's the tulpa of the culture. There's the tulpa of Homo sapiens sapiens. And so the question becomes then, is this basically, is this a happy place? Is this the energy of light and love, or is it the energy of darkness and warfare? And every single one of us is contributing to that. Every one of us is like a pebble dropped into the pool. And no matter how big the pool is and how irregular the perimeter is, the ripples will reach every part of the perimeter at some stage. So then becoming conscious, and realizing, am I purposefully thinking loving, light-filled thoughts? Am I speaking in a loving fashion? Am I acting in a loving way? Because what I'm doing is literally creating my own tulpa, the tulpa of my family, of my culture, and of Homo sapiens sapiens itself. So being aware. When Christ says then being awake, that's what he means. It's not staying up all night, and meditating. I can mean that, but it's about just being the guardian of my tulpa.
Well, thank you so much for this book. Anytime I come across something that I can just feel lets go some subtle layer of fear that I'm still holding on to from my past, I'm just so grateful. And I could talk to you for 3 hours, but what I love leaving listeners with one thing to focus on for the week, whether it's a thought or an action, to just kind of bring this all into the reality. What would you leave them with?
Well, I would say this to you specifically, but I say this constantly to people. Spend quality time with little children, particularly from age 2 to age 5. because they're living in a place where they're constantly going through the veil and backwards. And when they talk about imaginary friends, they're not imaginary. I distinguish between imagination and fantasy. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to shift my state of consciousness, move through the veil, interact with beings and energies that reside at the other side of the veil, learn from them, and bring it back to this side. And kids between 2 and 5 are doing that constantly. So if you have an opportunity to spend time around little children, join in their games, not patronizing, not tap them on the head and say, oh, that's a lovely idea. Really join in. They're going to take you through the veil. And so for anybody who has access to little children, that's the most important thing you can do. Join in their games, not patronizingly, but as a student.
For listeners that want to find your book or connect with you in other ways, where's the best place to find you?
Probably my website is called spiritsinSpacesuits.com. And so you have access, free access to, there's about 700 homilies and lectures and interviews up there that are freely available to everybody, and if people want to attend our Sunday masses, we have an online Zoom mass on Sundays, and so they'll find all that information on the website. So that's probably the best way to get to contact me.
All the links from this episode will be at mindlove.com/383. And your challenge for this week is to sit down with those 4 powerful questions that Sean shared. Who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? But here's the twist. Don't try to answer them perfectly. Just start writing whatever comes up, even if it feels messy or contradictory. And the point isn't to get it right. It's to start exploring what you actually believe, not what you've been told to believe. So give yourself permission to be honest and to question and to wonder. Your answers might change over time, and that's exactly how it should be. So give it a try and let me know how it goes. You can reach me at MindLoveMelissa on Instagram, or if you're part of the Mind Love Collective, we can talk about it there. And that reminds me, because you know how everyone's going crazy with New Year's resolutions right now? Well, here's something wild to consider. Our calendar is kind of arbitrary. It should actually have 13 months at 28 days, so we could track and feel our connection with nature's cycles. But our calendar was changed. That's a whole rabbit hole in itself. But the truth is, in nature's cycles, winter isn't meant for pushing and doing. It's more for reflecting and visioning. And that is exactly what we're focusing on in the Mind Love Collective this month. So if you want to work with these natural rhythms instead of against them, come join Mind Love Collective. It's actually sort of a social network for collective growth. We are working through month by month a focus point to actually bring in some of these things that we're learning, to make them real in our lives instead of just collecting more information. So check it out at mindlove.com/join. And if you want to start your mornings with some mindset magic, sign up for the Morning Mind Love at mindlove.com or text the word morning to 33777. Thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.